So there was this teacher who used, let's just say, suspect teaching methods, and she said to this little boy one day, you know, you never get anything right. What do you think you're going to be when you grow up? And the little boy said, a weatherman. I apologize to any potential weather forecasters out there, if any of you do that. So let's talk about the weather. You know, the weather is always a good, safe topic to discuss. I bet some of you managed to talk about the weather at your Thanksgiving get-togethers, just so you wouldn't have to talk about more controversial topics such as politics. And of course, you have to be careful that conversation about the weather doesn't turn into a politically oriented disagreement about such things as climate change or global warming. So I guess what that means is there is no such thing as a safe topic these days. Everything is on the table. Are any of you habitual Weather Channel watchers? Any of you like to do that a lot? Some of you, yeah. I don't do it much myself. I usually just confer with the little weather person in my phone. Although he, she, or it is rarely accurate, he, she, or it changes its mind quite often. However you get your weather report, it's not a bad idea, however, to sneak a peek at the weather forecast before you leave the house in the morning and go out and do your thing, because you never know when you're going to run into somebody that you have very little in common, and you need to have something to talk about. And if you find yourself in a conversation that's going absolutely nowhere, you can repeat this line that I have heard in every place I have ever lived in my entire life. People say it as if this is the only place anyone ever says it, and you know what it is. It's something like this. If you don't like the weather here, just wait 5 minutes and it'll change, or some variation on that. Have you ever heard that before, or something like that? Sure. People have been saying that since at least 1915, and Mark Twain, who died in 1910, is falsely credited with its origination. I don't know where it came from, but we should be thankful for our weather reports. Can you imagine living in a world without the Weather Channel, without Doppler radar, without tornado sirens? Although we are much more aware of what the weather is doing or will be doing in the next few days, we have been lulled to sleep by these technological advancements. We no longer need to be as alert or awake to the possibility that some powerful weather system is going to come through and overwhelm us. Now, from time to time, there is still an element of surprise to the weather. Sometimes something happens they didn't forecast, but for the most part, we don't worry about it as much as people did before the advent of modern, sophisticated weather information technology. And such was the case when Mark chapter 13 was written. The weather was a big concern in that place and time. In fact, in the ancient world. They didn't have any warning systems whatsoever, and so there was always a big concern about what Mother Nature was up to. And by the way, it really is more appropriate to use the term Mother Nature when we're talking about the life-giving and nurturing aspects of nature. However, even moms at times lose their cool. They throw a temper tantrum, they blow a gasket, and so if our moms can do it, so can Mother Nature. Sometimes Mother Nature can really throw a tantrum, and the weather can become downright apocalyptic. Now, that's a word you don't hear every day. The word apocalyptic comes from a Greek word that means to uncover or reveal. The ancients believed that the purpose of when they saw severe weather patterns occurring or rare events in nature, they thought this was revealing or uncovering God's wrath or fury. Something nasty is about to happen, they thought, when they see weird things going on outside. Excuse me. I'm a little under the weather today. Sorry. I couldn't resist that one. Andy can tell you. I may not be able to complete this. Excuse me. Okay. So, when Mark was written, things were already pretty nasty. There was already a lot to fear about the present, excuse me, and about the future. And it wasn't the weather. Climate change, global warming, none of that was an issue in that day. Neither was there a potential ice age or anything like that. Excuse me. The biggest issue of that day, excuse me. The biggest issue of that day was the Roman occupation of Palestine and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Excuse me. This is a need-to-know basis. Mark was written about the same time that the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, which was in 70 A.D. Okay, so think about this. We're reading what was written at the time the temple was destroyed, which of course was the center of their identity, their cultural, religious life, and so forth. And so Mark is looking back several decades, and he tells this story about Jesus, which is, one day Jesus and his disciples are walking out of the temple, and they were gawking at this large complex of buildings. You know, sort of like country bumpkins come to town and they look up at the skyscrapers and like, wow, look at this. And so as they stood there staring at these magnificent edifices, Jesus tells them, this is all going to be destroyed someday. Now, how did he know that? Well, if he truly predicted this, we can assume that he was a very astute observer of the social and political climate of the day. He knew that Jewish unrest would eventually lead to a revolution against the Roman occupiers, and then guess what the Romans are going to do? Because they're going to hit them where it hurts. They're going to knock down the temple. They're going to destroy the temple, which they did. He didn't need to read any tea leaves or confer with any crystal balls to predict that this was going to happen. And some of the things that he talks about are clear evidence that there is trouble on the horizon. He said there are false prophets and messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, famine, persecution, family betrayals. There was just general suffering all the way around. So this implies there's a lot of social upheaval. Things are not going well. And as a first century man, Jesus also seems to have believed that the weather or patterns in nature can also provide signs of future events, what I talked about a minute ago. And so he mentions earthquakes and eclipses and falling stars, and there's this vague reference to powers in the heavens that will be shaken. And then he refers to even a milder expression of nature, which he says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. In other words, watch nature. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Excuse me. So ancient people, including Jesus, were much more in tune with weather and nature than we are today, because acts of nature were so mysterious. They could not explain why or how these things were happening. And so they just assumed these were the acts of God. So in the ancient world, acts of nature were acts of God. There was no other explanation available to them. And so if things started looking particularly threatening or ominous, then God must be up to something. The weather report in the ancient world was a God report. It's the same thing. That's how different we are today from where they were back then. Our whole worldview is different. So, a long explanation with coughing, right? But where's the good news in all that? Where's the good news in this? You know, finding good news in apocalyptic writings is sort of like finding good news in horror movies. It's there, but you have to look really close for it. You have to read between the lines and interpret that. For example, I sort of enjoy watching the apocalyptic television series called The Walking Dead. Any Walking Dead fans out here? A few, yeah? Which is really, it's based on a fictional zombie apocalypse. That's what it's all about. And the only good news that I've found in this, this storyline is that you can kill the zombies by killing their brains. It took a while for them to figure that out. When they did, though, they got a handle on things. But in other words, even in these sort of scenarios, there's always hope. Hope. See the word over there? Hope. What drives or fuels not only modern apocalyptic storylines, but ancient apocalyptic literature like Mark chapter 13 is hope in the midst of utter hopelessness. Sometimes we say it this way, hope against hope. That's what these things are about. That's what that literature that was written back then was about. And so for the Gospel of Mark, the hope that he zeroed in on is that Jesus will return. Not as a zombie, but he will return. And here is how Mark puts it. This is Jesus speaking. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds, which is a natural formation, with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. He's coming back. In other words, in the midst of social and political upheaval, wars, earthquakes, famines, persecutions, injustices, false prophets, and now, in the midst of American social and racial upheaval, political division and gridlock, perpetual war, threats of nuclear war, enormous hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, daily sexual harassment reports, and fake news. In the midst of all that, Mark is telling us the Son of Man will come and make everything better. That's the message of hope that's always in front of us, that's always our forecast. I'm going to add a little caveat to this, however. When you think about it, I'm not so sure we should always be talking about the literal return of Jesus. Now, bear with me for a moment. Because after 2,000 years, if we keep going around saying, Jesus is coming back, going to make everything all right, after 2,000 years, it begins to sound a little bit like the boy that cried wolf. So maybe we should tweak that a little bit and be talking about a reconsideration of the world he envisioned. A reconsideration of the world he envisioned. And in that world he envisioned, human beings have a reason to be hopeful. Clearly, hopelessness dominates the news these days. Doesn't it feel like that? And anytime there's a weather report on the news, which seems to be happening a lot, it seems kind of hopeless. And yet the good news is that we are entering into a season that offers a very different perspective, a season that shines a brighter light on the future of humanity. So my hope-filled forecast for Advent and Christmas this year is clear and sunny skies. I don't need a crystal ball to predict that peace, love, and joy will soon be upon us. Amen.